Good boy.
Well, welcome. We're in chapter 6, finishing up the biographical side of Daniel's life. And then we're going to start talking about kind of things we need to understand before we get into chapter 7. Things that will prepare us to understand all the different ways we can misunderstand chapter 7, which there are many of those. And I'm going to pray for us, and then we'll get started in chapter 6. And it should not take long. You've all seen this story, a myriad of times in your life. Most of them you probably saw Daniel was young, though, in pictures, didn't you? You didn't realize 85-year-old man or something to that effect. Well, let's pray, and we'll get started. Lord, we thank you for this evening. We want to hear from you. We want to see your word speak to us and change us. Forgive us for our sins. Help us to follow you better. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Chapter 6 is something, it's the last story about Daniel's life that shows the same pattern as every other story about Daniel and the Hebrew boys. We don't know if the other Hebrew servants were still alive at this point, because all we have is Daniel. But this is after the kingdom of Belshazzar is leveled by the Medo-Persian alliance. And if you remember last week, we think we know who Darius is from history. We think he is a man that the Greek historian Herodotus and Xenophon call Gobryas. Then again, some commentators want to say that this is Xerxes. Cyrus, not Xerxes. Xerxes, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is Cyrus, the Persian emperor. The kingdom of Persia and Media allied together and formed the Medo-Persian Empire. I told you last week why I thought it is Gobryas, and that's that the name sounds very similar. And also, the Greek historians tell us that Gobryas was given control of Babylonia while Cyrus went along building his empire and knocking out other kingdoms. If it is Cyrus, then it does not change the meaning of the text. But like I said, my opinion is that it's Gobryas, the man whose son was killed in a hunting, quote, accident by King Belshazzar, who history has told us was a murderer and a horrible person, and that he now rules over the province and the kingdoms around Babylon, the big city, and that he's doing administration in this chapter. We already know from chapter 2 and 3 what he's doing. It's a new administration. And as we've said, religion and politics were the same thing in the ancient world. I had told y'all last week that King Belshazzar had persecuted some of the priests of Marduk, and he had messed up all the rituals, and the Babylonians are mad at him. So when Darius comes and takes charge of the city, one of the first things he does is he tries another, almost like a loyalty pledge, like we saw in chapter 3 when Nebuchadnezzar said, there's this big image in the plain outside the walls. I want everyone to bow to it when I play the theme song for our empire. Well, in this one, it's going to be a little different. There's a different, I'd say, loyalty test. And so we'll get started on chapter 6. You all know the story. And there's nothing really too out of the ordinary happening here that you haven't read before. I'll start reading. And it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one. And over them, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. And this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. So we know the same format of this story. Daniel excels in administration. because God is with him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." So you see the same setup as last time. Daniel is doing really good, but he's got a different religious system that gets his loyalty. So these administrators around him start trying to find a way to get him looking for a religious reason, much like the jealousy against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in chapter 3 with the image. So obviously they do not want Daniel, this outsider, to be over them. Now these people might have been former Babylonian officials that had been promoted after the expungement of King Belshazzar, or they might have been Persian and Median nobles who came in riding the coattails of King Cyrus and King Darius. But it might have been a mix even, some old-timers and some newbies. Whatever it was, they all united in saying this Daniel was causing a problem and had to go. So then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever." Notice everyone's always telling him to live forever. "All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions." So this is an interesting thing here, because it reads as if the king might think that he's being prayed to, but that's not what's happening here. Most commentators say that what we see here is that the king is functioning as a priest, and this is pretty common in the Middle East. The king is not trying to say, "I'm a god and you should pray to me." He's saying, "I'm the access point to the gods, and you need to mediate all your requests through me." Now, why would he do this? What's missing from the list of officials in the kingdom that we've seen in previous chapters? A couple of words missing. What's missing?
The priests and the scribes.
Think about back when Nebuchadnezzar was around. Who were some of the people that were always mentioned in the higher echelons of the government that he was looking?
The magicians and the soothsayers and all those
Yes,
guys.
right.
and
Know what you're
the
talking about.
Chaldeans, the Kasdim, as that's the Aramaic word for it. So the enchanters, the magicians, the soothsayers, and the Kasdim are missing. It looks like there's been a religious purge when Darius took over. In fact, what we may see here is that, remember how I told you there was religious upheaval under Belshazzar? Darius might have gotten tired of all these different factions trying to regain power once Belshazzar was gone, and he might have said, "Listen, this is a great idea. You don't go to your, church to pray for the next 30 days. You don't go to your temple. You don't go to the Chaldeans, because we've kicked them out of government. They're too loyal to Nebuchadnezzar's family, and I'm not having a rebellion. You want something from the gods, you bring it to me. You sacrifice in front of me, and I'll take it to God because I'm the channel." He's setting himself up to be the state priest for 30 days to unify the way the government works, to keep everyone in order, and to keep all the infighting from stopping, perhaps. It sounds like it's very similar to Nebuchadnezzar dealing with all these people trying to get his ear. And he's like, "You know what? We need a giant image, and everyone needs to worship that so that we all unify around my new state." Darius is doing a very similar thing. He's probably trying to kick the Kasdim to the curb, the enchanters, all the people who say, we can tell your dreams, from Nebuchadnezzar's administration. He's got some new officials and maybe some old ones, and he just wants everybody to do the same thing, because government and religion are linked. Remember that. Government and religion are linked. So they sign a document, they pass it all around the kingdom, and in verse 10, if somebody will read verse 10 through verse 13, I'd much appreciate it.
Now
Daniel,
Daniel had learned that the decree had been published. He went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he has done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asked God for help, praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being, except you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day.
So we see that he got tattled on. Much like the 3 boys in chapter 3, all of the other administrators tattletale on an old man, Daniel. And verse 14, now obviously something's happened where this king really likes Daniel, and I'm going to give you a reason for that. If you remember last week when I told you, if this man here, Darius, is really Gobrias, that's the Greek pronunciation of the name in Xenophon and Herodotus' histories, he was an administrator or a higher up noble, a ruler of a city near there through much of his career. Daniel was quite well known in the area, especially of a large power like that. If he had ever visited during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, if he ever visited Babylon, he probably would have met Daniel or been accustomed to hearing him or seeing him in state functions. So when it says that that he wants to deliver Daniel, it's not just that he thinks Daniel's pretty cool. I've liked him for a couple of months. Seems like a good guy. He knows from way back in the day this guy is a straight shooter, and he always served Nebuchadnezzar well. And Belshazzar kicked him out of the government. Remember, because he had to go haul him out to bring him into that banquet he was having. So he knows he's loyal, and he knows that he's gifted. And so verse 14, then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. He knows what a valuable state servant he is because of his history. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement of the king and said to the king, know, O king, that is the law of the Medes and Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. So they had a form of no man's above the law. And they're really holding the king to this. And so, you can really see Darius's his vexation at this, where he wants to rescue him, but he can't stop the law. So, verse 16. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you. So he really wants him to be safe. This is not like Nebuchadnezzar, who's like, no God can deliver you from my hand if I threw you in the fiery furnace. This king is just hoping that the law can still be followed, but Daniel can still be saved. Verse 17, and a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. So a really different character of a king than we saw from Nebuchadnezzar, right? This man is a lot more down to earth, isn't he? Anybody see anything in the text they want to talk about or bring out before we move to the end of it?
Well, unlike Nebuchadnezzar, I think that King Darius believed in God as the one true God.
Yeah, he might have, I think I mentioned this last week, that one of the reasons Belshazzar probably brought out the articles of the Lord's temple to drink out of were because he was mocking God and saying, I know those prophecies about Cyrus and him supposed to, liberate people, and we're not falling to him. Those scriptures are not going to come true. And, Darius and Cyrus probably knew those too, because a lot of those writings were known in the region. And they might have known, this is the God that his prophets foretold that we would raise up and destroy the Babylonians, and the Babylonians would be punished. So there might have been a lot more respect from day one for Daniel and his God than Nebuchadnezzar was bringing to the table, half a century ago.
And he says that in the next verses.
Yep. He does. Well, let's finish up the story. Then at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? And Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. Now, Daniel says that too. The servants said it earlier. Daniel says it. Just the way that they would, greet the king. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm. And the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. There's a reason that the judgment was brought so swiftly upon those people, and you kind of can see the logic of this. It appears to me that regardless of the law of the Medes and Persians, the king knew if hungry lions don't eat a man, God is involved, and he's shown what side he's on. And so there were these men who were chomping at the bit to kill Daniel, and God made sure he wasn't killed. Therefore, God is pleased with him, and those other people are the enemies of all that's good and right. And you kind of see Daniel say that, where he's saying, no harm was found, and I did no harm before you, and no wrong was found with me. And it's kind of like, well, something supernatural obviously was at work here.
Well, what I saw in that, where the wives and children were chucked in the lion's den and freely gobbled, was that in the ancient times, if you killed everybody, but maybe one son still survived, he'd grow up in revenge.
Yeah.
And what I saw in Daniel so far is that I know that Daniel's not Jesus, but boy, he kept the law, and he did what was right. He didn't, not like David, where David got in trouble. I haven't read yet that Daniel ever did anything that was wrong.
Yeah, he does not have any major failure that's recorded in Scripture. Though he was a sinful human like all of us, he did not have any major breach of character that sullied his testimony. It's interesting you're talking about punishing other generations, Ted. That, you know, my wife tells me about growing up, you know, in her home country when the commies would come into town, and if one person in the family would do something bad, they would just take stuff from the entire family, aunts, uncles, cousins. You know, you punish the entire family for one person's crime. It's part of the way that you get people to rat out on each other too. So it still happens in some places.
Josh, I like the fact that when it says that they found Daniel making petition. No, that's not the place that I wanted. Giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously.
Right.
This wasn't, he didn't get on his knees because of the crisis.
Right.
This was his ordinary everyday practice, and maybe why we don't see anything recorded, any major failure, like you said.
Yeah.
He was just carrying on like he always had.
Yeah, he wasn't a rebel about it. He just was doing what he always did.
Right.
There's, you know, some people who, if you tell them not to pray 3 times a day, they're going to start praying 3 times a day. And that's not the reason Daniel was doing it. Well, King Darius in verse 25 wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on all the earth, peace multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, which we said, you know, Gobrius, and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So once again, one of the reasons that that I believe this was the king of Babylon, the man that Xenophon and Herodotus write about, who was one of the commanders under Cyrus, rewarded with the throne of the murderer, possibly, of his son. So now this man looks like, from this decree that's gone out, much like Nebuchadnezzar, just has to confront the fact that God is in control of all these things around him. And, you know, this is the last, I guess, chronologically speaking, the last event that happens in Daniel's professional life that's related to the state function of the government he works in. And so we're done with his life as biography. What we're beginning to get into now is his life as a prophet, as a recorder of visions. And so I sent you articles to read. And if you got a chance to read through any of those, we're going to discuss them briefly so that next week when we start talking about chapter 7, we're ready. And so this is going to start a discussion on eschatology, which is just a fancy way of saying end time studies. Eschaton is the end, and you know, anytime you add ology to the end, it's talking about the study or the science of something. So the study of the end, the study of last things. And Daniel is going to have a very specific point of reference in the book of Revelation. We're going to see a lot of imagery that is going to be reused in the book of Revelation. So just so you know, commentators say that chapter 7 is the most important chapter in Daniel, that it is the, you know, it's really the fulcrum point, the crux of his message. All of chapters 1 through 6 just show that God was working in history to protect Daniel, you ask, why was God protecting Daniel and his people so much? You know, like in the book of Esther, we see that God protected the Jews during the Persian Empire. The book of Nehemiah and Ezra, we see the same thing. Well, the book of Daniel, you know, God protects his people, but he protects Daniel. And we begin to see that Daniel wasn't just an administrator, but he was really a vessel for this message. What's going to be so important about this message is that the imagery and the words he uses are going to be some of the very words and imagery that Jesus uses during his ministry. So Daniel's message is really going to prepare the Jewish people to take Jesus's message because of the imagery and the terminology used. So I gave you 3 different views on the book of Daniel, and we're just going to go over them briefly. I'm going to ask questions. I want this to be discussion oriented, but the first one is historicism. Historicism, in this view, the book of Daniel is just like a big roadmap from here in Daniel's time all the way to where we are now. It's things that are happening throughout history, event by event, or sometimes like a pattern. And that's one view on Daniel. It was the first view on Daniel. Obviously, the original Jewish commentators believed it was, and the early Christian fathers believed it. They had different views on it. All the way up until Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, people viewed Daniel historically. So any questions or comments about, and right now we're not going to argue about whether Daniel is historicism, preterism, or futurism, but we're talking about historicism in general. Any questions or comments on historicism as a view?
Josh, not about historicism, but can I ask you something about what I thought you mentioned last week?
Yes, sir.
7 and 8. Chapter 7 starts out as saying that this vision of Daniel, the first vision, occurs in the first year of Belshazzar's reign.
Yes, sir.
In chapter 8, it says that second vision occurs during the third year of Belshazzar's reign. Now, chapter 6 ended Belshazzar's reign.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, chapter 5. So, chronologically, does these next 2 chapters, 7 that we're talking about now and 8, do they fit chronologically between 4 and 5? Because they do refer these dreams occurring during the first and the third year of Belshazzar's reign, which ended at the end of chapter 5.
Right.
Or could-
Yes. You
No,
are.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I just say, is this for me? Is this where it starts that from one verse, from one chapter to the other, there may be long periods of time?
There can be. It's not. It's like this. It's not a necessary conclusion, but it's a possible conclusion.
Okay.
What John was referencing is, and I think I said this at the beginning, that Daniel is not written chronologically. It's written topically. The first topic are the tests and trials of the Hebrew boys in Daniel and their faithfulness. And those are mainly chronologically because they go through the kings. But then chapter 7, if you remember, Nabonidus and his adopted son, we believe Belshazzar, co-ruled the kingdom together. Nabonidus lived 500 miles to the south in the desert near a shrine to the moon goddess, and Belshazzar ruled Babylonia and the northern areas. Their reign, everyone says you don't know exactly how long the reign is, but about a decade. Maybe up to 20 years if you aren't quite sure when Nebuchadnezzar's reign ended and when other people's reign began, because we already know that Nebuchadnezzar, towards the end, his son probably co-reigned with him. And so we don't know if we're still counting Nebuchadnezzar's reign with some of his sons, or if they're separate whenever you read the chronicles of it. All that to say, we know that there was a decade or so where Belshazzar was ruling. And remember from last week, Daniel had semi-retired because Nebuchadnezzar had been dead about 23 years. And so he sees this vision kind of in semi-retirement. And in chapter 8, the same thing. He is out of the government, or if he still has connections, he's out of the court. He's not a regular. He's not one of the trusted people. And he sees this vision as he's just living. He's, probably in his 60s right now, upper 50s or 60s. And so he's just seeing things. This is why, God preserved his life to be the conduit for these visions that come out of this. That was a really good point earlier about looking at the chronological timing of when this happened compared to last chapter. Any questions about historicism, or need any clarification of what it is?
I don't need necessarily the clarification, as when I was reading through, I was trying to figure out these are three different forms of Christianity. What would the Baptist Convention, in terms of our history and our beliefs, what would we fall under?
Let me wait until the end of tonight to say what we kind of fall under, just because you'll kind of see when we get to it. Because, it's like this. It's like most things. If you say, am I liberal or conservative? And I go, well, I'm pretty conservative. Unless we're talking about this over here, then, I could see somebody's point on this. But with economics and, stuff like abortion, I'm very conservative. And so if you ask me to label myself, I might say, well, conservative here, and maybe a little, like moderate here, and with the whole influence of corporations in elections, almost sound like a liberal here, because, just it's politics. Not any party is going to have 100% support from a Christian, unless it's Jesus. And the political parties, Jesus will support 100%. But eschatological views are kind of similar, because I'll be like, I like historicism a little bit. I like futurism a little bit. And so, at the end of the night, I think you'll kind of see what I'm trying to say better than I could say it now. Well, the next view is preterism. And there's full preterism and partial preterism. And preterist, the whole idea behind it is it's almost like saying it's short historicism. It was historicism for about 150 years, and then it was over, and Daniel is done. The book of Daniel is over. There's nothing for us today with the book of Daniel. That's full preterism. Partial preterism is just kind of like being a historicist who says, wait a little bit and one more thing might happen. For example, they might say, there still has to be like a few more days, a few more little weeks in Daniel's vision before we're able to say that the book of Daniel's done. And so a preterist means it's in the past and we're done with it. And then the last one is futurism. And futurism says that there's going to be a future fulfillment. So obviously Daniel was a futurist when he wrote this. The question would be, is Daniel a futurist today? If Daniel was alive today and his book had been written, for 2,500 years, and he said, I'm a futurist, it still all has to happen That's what a futurist is. Now, we're talking about Daniel, not Revelation. We're not talking about the Olivet Discourse of Jesus, talking about the temple. We're not talking about Paul's predictions of the end time, but just with Daniel. The book of Daniel is so clear that part of what it's talking about are the progression of empires from Babylonia, Medo-Persia, the Greek empires of Alexander and his successors, and Rome. I mean, it's very clear that some of this has to do with that. So, you know, you ask, what is the Southern Baptist view on the book of Daniel? Well, part of it is we see that it is partially fulfilled. But there's stuff in Daniel that you look at it and say, this hasn't happened yet, as far as we can tell. And so you got to be a little bit futurist too. You know, we can discuss which parts have happened and which parts haven't, because I've read books before of people trying to interpret Daniel like it's all in the future. And I'm not against looking for a future fulfillment. My main thing is that part of Daniel deals with Jesus. And if it hasn't been fulfilled when Jesus came and did what it talks about, then we start to, I don't know, we start to almost limit Christ's ministry. There's a prediction in the book of Daniel, and we're going to add it up when we get to it, year by year. And this is wild. It foretells the year of the crucifixion. And if all of Daniel's in the future, you rob that predictive prophecy. This is a problem for liberals, because you remember I told you liberals think that Daniel was written like in 250 BC when all this stuff was passed, except for the Roman Empire, which it accurately foretells. And they had no way of knowing the Roman Empire was going to be that big in 250 BC. And it foretells to the year when Jesus should be crucified. It's like you want to ask the liberals, what do you gain by saying 250 BC? He still foretells half the future, which is miraculous. You know, why not just back it up to in the 500s when he lived and say, looks like he foretold it all. God gave him the message. It's not miraculous to us that he could do this, because God's capable of doing that to somebody. He's capable of telling him. But futurism and preterism kind of mix. And, you know, a partial preterist is a partial futurist. If you don't believe it's all fulfilled, some of it still has to be fulfilled. So most Baptists who study Daniel and I think have a good handle on the history would be between 2 and 3, you know, partial preterist and partial futurist with Daniel's message. Does that make sense, Miss Jo?
Yeah, it does. I'm trying to remember. Seventh-day Adventists, were they? I read it and I can't remember what they were. Weren't they preterist?
I believe so, and I'm looking it up real quick because I know they have a very...
They and the Jehovah Witnesses both were. It does say here, in effect, this makes preterism unorthodox in the eyes of partial preterists and gives rise to the claim by some that full preterism is heretical. Yeah, that's not.
Yeah, heretical.
But I do remember reading that they were Seventh-day Adventist.
It looks here like, yeah, like they're a little bit amillennialist, because they don't believe in the traditional view of a millennium. And I don't know, they kind of have I'm looking at this. It just says that they don't hold the traditional view of the premillennial and non-postmillennial.
Plus, the Jehovah Witnesses, when you look at their Bible, it's not anything like ours.
Yeah, they changed a little bit. No, they do believe in, so Seventh-day Adventists do believe in the millennium, but regardless of all that, I mean, you're going to find, like, for example, you would find at the seminary I went to for theology, a premillennialist and an amillennialist on the same staff. And you would ask them why. And the amillennialist would convince you that amillennialism sounded right. You go talk to the premillennialist and he'd convince you that premillennialism sounds right. You talk to the postmillennialist. I don't think there were any on campus where I went, but I've read some before, and they'll almost have you convinced that they're right. And it's so difficult because everybody has got a different verse they use, and they say this is the most important verse to remember when you study the end times. I stopped trying to find the most important verse.
Yeah, I knew a post-millennialist years ago who tried to convince me that the 1,000 years is finished and we're in a new period. I mean, really? I didn't know that. Yeah.
You
I
have
sure hope not.
post-millennialists who
This
argue.
is not what my Bible describes as the millennium.
Yeah.
It better be a whole lot better than this.
Well, that's I was talking to somebody before about millennialism, and he was joking. He was saying, I won't even say when I go to the doctor. I dislike it so much. He said it's the most depressing eschatology in the world to me, because when you look at stuff and it's so bad, you think it'll be better when Jesus comes back. And the amillennialist looks at you and says, he already is. You know, get over it. And you're going, it's got to be better than this. You know, this can't be it. And, you know, Daniel's not going to teach about, Daniel's not going to give us enough information to get to a millennium viewpoint.
But it does go to the fact that you really shouldn't read Revelations until you truly know the Old Testament.
That is right.
That's
That is right.
Psalms, there are things that are prophesizing what's going to happen with Jesus's walk and his death and resurrection.
Right.
And you know, you and I've discussed the fact that the book of Revelation is something that you take literally, and there's no way to understand it literally unless you know your Old Testament.
Right. So I want to give you a real quick idea of how I think we should read Daniel based on these three schools. When we go through chapter 7 next week, and we're talking about it, this week, if you got a chance to study it, I want you to read it and just think to yourself, or you can email me if you want to collect your thoughts and talk. When you say, how would a historicist read Daniel? Chapter 7. How would a preterist read Daniel chapter 7? How would a futurist read it? If you can kind of look at the chapter and see the three different views interpretively, I think it's going to help you when we get deeper in the book to go, okay, I remember reading it as a futurist here, and that's not an option right now. It can't be. Or you may say, you know, I really like the futurist reading. Now that I've got to chapter 8 and 9, I really think this is a good reading of the book. There's going to be another problem with this book, not problem, but difficulty in interpreting it. And simply put, that's going to be when we get to chapter 11 and 12. Chapter 11 and 12 are so, I'm trying to think of the right word. They're so out there, especially chapter 12. It's like Daniel runs off a cliff and is hanging in eternity. Revelation does that too, by the way, which is why it's so important we know what Daniel's saying before we even set foot in Revelation. Chapter 11 and 12 are going to make you feel like there's got to be more to it than this. And I think that's why the book of Revelation was written, was to fill in some of the space in Daniel 11 and 12. Obviously, the book of Daniel is for a purpose. God let it be written for a purpose. And the purpose is not so that we can look in the newspaper when we wake up tomorrow and go, okay, let's see if any of this is foretold in Daniel. It's the same thing with the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation was not written so that you could fill in your end times crossword puzzle. I know who the Antichrist is. 6 across, you know, we've got the right letters now. It's so that when you go through lions' dens and fiery furnaces, and when you go under persecution, or when you're under temptation, or when you're just living and going, what am I doing with my life? You remember that God has history and he's bringing it to a conclusion where his kingdom, which I believe is on earth right now, his kingdom will never end. His kingdom will just increase. And it looks like both from the end of Daniel and the end of Revelation, God wins and we'll be okay. And so,
Well, we know the end of the story.
oh yeah,
I've got a book / commentary from David Storch. I don't know if you've heard of him or not. He's Presbyterian, and he calls Daniel the Old Text, and he calls Revelation the New Text. He just thinks it's John rewrote it, pretty much.
I think they really, it's almost like you've got the alphabet and Daniel around the letter L starts getting choppy and you don't have all the letters in order. And then you put Revelation kind of, you know, back where it starts to link up with Daniel, and you have the whole alphabet at that point. You have the whole story of history. I also think, like I said earlier, Daniel is so important. We're going to get into this. It's so important in how Jesus saw himself. You know, what was Jesus' title for himself? Son of Man, right?
Yep.
That's a very Daniel title. That's talked about a lot at the end of Daniel. So next week, I'm ready for chapter 7. What I'm planning, if you want to focus in on some of it, is I'm going to try to get at least to verse 14, maybe verse 22.
And are we still going to be on Zoom next week?
Yeah, we'll still be on Zoom. Yeah, First Essentials is not going to start back on campus for a while. We're just, you know, we're trying to phase stuff back slowly. And we don't have our children's choir practices in place yet. We don't have, you know, because kids sitting around singing and picking on each other for a long time, maybe not the most hygienic thing. We want to wait till we know the air is a bit more clear.
Yeah.
And so First Essential is still going to be on Zoom for a while. I'll let you know if we make a change of timing. I don't know if it's going to be New Year when we go back to the full schedule or before then, but I think for right now, you know, we're going back Bible study at 9 a.m., one service, and then Wednesday nights, and we're going to just see what happens. So,
Yeah, Josh, Wade told me today I could start the men's Bible study back on Friday mornings.
Yep.
So,
yeah, I saw your email about that when I opened up my email a minute
That's
ago.
my next question. I didn't know if you got it or not with your
Yep.
earlier conversation.
Yeah, when I opened up a few minutes ago, I saw it. But yeah, I will let y'all know when First Essentials goes back on campus. We just have not decided yet. We're still watching and seeing how school will affect the numbers. Santa Rosa County opened up before us, and I have not seen any massive increases in their numbers due to school opening up. So if things continue to die down and the numbers keep dropping, we'll keep opening things up. Well,
Again, I appreciate
go
what
ahead,
you're.
Miss Joe.
I said again before. I just am really appreciating the literature that you're sending us before we read a chapter. I mean, even if I don't understand it, which these three I don't get yet, but I really would be out there without these three to at least look at.
Keep studying them, because they're pretty interesting, especially if you want to go look at Revelations after this. You'll really go down a rabbit trail.
You don't want to do that.
I'm going to send y'all some commentary pages when I scan them this week from chapter 7. And just to give you an idea, y'all know the gate I sent you from King Nebuchadnezzar, the Ishtar gate. The one of the biggest, one of the most frequent symbols of Babylon for itself was a lion. And the lions had wings on them. And which is pretty cool, because that's the image that's given for the first beast out of the sea. But look, if you got your Bible real quick, chapter 7 verse 4, I'll send you the commentary on this, because it's pretty interesting. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. That's gonna give us a little bit of an idea of how to interpret the first beast. You think about this. Who's that talking about?
Babylon.
Yeah,
And which guy was a beast?
Belshazzar.
Well, no, but think about back in chapter 4. Who became like a beast?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
And God
And he
humbled
actually,
him.
and he had hair like feathers on an eagle. Yeah.
And so it's this scene where, like, even in the little verse here, God was doing something with Nebuchadnezzar that kind of translates into the description of the kingdom here. This goes back to our discussion from chapter 4. Was Nebuchadnezzar saved at some point? If God gave him the heart of a man, the mind of a man, it's just interesting. I mean, there's just little stuff in the text that's interesting. Or like the bear, where it was raised up on one side. Like, what does that mean? And so the commentators go wild trying to describe what this is. And I think it's pretty interesting that God describes these kingdoms the way he does. We start getting into the goat with the horns. Go into the history of it, though, and you're going to be, I'll just give you one example real quick. When I was growing up and reading Hal Lindsey books, Hal Lindsey believes that Daniel is still to be fulfilled in the future. He has a very futuristic perspective on it. He thinks it's talking about a war with the Antichrist versus the people of Israel. And that's how I learned to study the book of Daniel. And then in college, I started reading about the wars between the Alexandrian kingdoms. And I started reading about one of the kings named Antiochus Epiphanes. And I started reading about the crazy stuff he did, how he went into the temple, killed a bunch of the priests, sacrificed unclean animals in there, set up a shrine to himself. And I started reading Daniel, and I went, wait a minute, that's the third kingdom, Babylon, Medo-Persia, the Greeks. That's the third kingdom. And he was the northern king and fighting the southern king, and you start going through it and going, I just never learned the history. And it was interesting because like the book of Daniel was telling me what I was learning in history, but from this cosmic perspective. And you saw, you know, I mean, you read this and you see the character of people. There's a reason that Alexander is called a leopard. You know, leopards are fast. He went over the known world in 10 years. There's a reason the Medo-Persian Empire is a bear with, you know, raised up on one side. So I'm going to send you all the commentaries that I've been studying. Now, a lot of this is very subjective. I you know, only the mind of God knows what the 3 ribs were in the bear's mouth and why there were 3 ribs. But the commentaries sometimes give some pretty cool examples. And I hope they're useful. I try not to stay too fused to any viewpoint when it comes to eschatology, because I've been wrong so many times in my life based on who I talked to last. And so I try to say, what can we know the Bible's teaching us, and go from there.
It's a good study.
Any questions, comments, complaints, or requests?
I'm glad Daniel was saved from the lion's den.
Yeah. I remember seeing pictures of it as a kid, and he was always a really young man. And
Yeah, that was cool. But you know, when the 3 were in the fiery furnace walking with the 4th one, that's got to be my favorite one right there.
Yeah.
I mean, how hot was that? 700 degrees hotter than ever, or something like that.
Well, I appreciate y'all, and I hope y'all have a great evening and a good week. And we'll see you next Sunday, all right?
All righty.
You
Taking
too. Bye.
Y'all take care.